They say trouble comes at you in the dead of night, rattling the windows of your peace just when you think you're safest. That was precisely how it felt for everyone in Brooklyn County the night Detective Marcus Mack Henderson and his partner, Sergeant Doug Rooker, drove their unmarked sedan down a narrow street and stumbled upon the woman who would soon turn their crooked ambitions into rubble. It was only years later that people would whisper about the look in her eyes, or the way she carried herself, or how she chose to remain silent about her actual line of work. In that single heartbeat of a moment, nobody, least of all the cops themselves, had any clue that the woman standing at the receiving end of their intimidation was more powerful than their entire ring of corruption combined. But that's getting ahead of the story. Her name was Ebony Williams, a 35-year-old African-American woman with the kind of unflinching determination that could electrify a room if she so much as raised an eyebrow. Officially, Ebony was a U.S. attorney on a special assignment, tasked with investigating an uptick in civil rights violations across rural counties in the state. Unofficially, she was the last person you wanted to cross if you had skeletons in your closet. Ebony never played on her identity or her credentials as weapons of pride. She wielded them purely for justice. Despite her formidable status, Ebony had managed to remain incognito in Brooklyn County by living simply away from the bustle of the big city and wearing the unassuming clothes of a regular resident. Hardly anyone suspected that she held such power in her gentle hands, and Ebony found she got more authentic interactions this way. When she moved to the county's quieter neighborhoods, introducing herself as a volunteer helping out at local nonprofits, folks saw only a kind-hearted woman who wanted to make a difference. She had come to Brooklyn County on the heels of a disturbing rumor. There were too many stories swirling about corruption in the local police department. The rumor was that an insular network of officers, spurred on by greed and under-the-table deals, was planting evidence on unsuspecting citizens. Most disturbingly, young black residents reported being disproportionately targeted and brutalized. Ebony's gut told her something was off the moment she dug into the arrest records. The same judge's name kept appearing, Judge Thornton Hawkins, and Ebony had heard only whispers about how Hawkins seemed to mete out suspiciously harsh sentences, especially for people of color. A cold rage, balanced by her iron discipline, burned inside her. She made it her mission to understand how and why these stories intersected. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered and incomplete, but Ebony could sense that the final picture was going to be ugly. That night, Ebony had been driving home from her volunteer shift at a local after-school center. She'd stayed late, reviewing homework and reading to children from battered neighborhoods while their parents worked second shifts. Sleep tugged at her eyes as she navigated the back roads, but the exhaustion was overshadowed by an odd sense of vigilance. Something in the crisp, quiet air made the hair on the back of her neck prickle. She couldn't put a name to it, maybe just the after-effects of her simmering frustration over the county's corruption. She caught herself gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if expecting something to leap out of the darkness. And then she saw the flashing red and blue lights in her rear-view mirror. Ebony had done nothing wrong, but she eased the car to the side of the road all the same, heart pounding, not out of guilt, but out of a deeper concern for what might follow. She wasn't immune to the stories that so many people like her had experienced. The dreaded scenario of a routine traffic stop turned sour. In her mind, she was no different from any other black driver pulled over on a lonesome stretch of asphalt, the night air suddenly thick with tension. She carefully reached for her wallet. In that split second, she made a decision. She wouldn't reveal her identity as a federal attorney just yet. She wanted to see how they would treat her, and if it was anything like the rumors she'd been hearing, she would finally have incontrovertible proof. Detective Henderson approached her window. His footsteps were deliberate, with a swagger that practically broadcast his sense of authority. Ebony had grown up in a rough neighborhood and recognized the brand of false bravado that certain officers wore to mask their insecurity. She could almost smell the arrogance wafting off him. Sergeant Rooker stayed back, one hand on his belt, eyes flicking across the interior of her car like he was eager to spot something incriminating. License and registration, Henderson barked. His tone was clipped, with an edge that felt unprofessional, borderline hostile. Ebony offered him the documents. He scanned them quickly, glancing from the photo to her face with a slight smirk. "Where you headed?" he asked, a question that Ebony knew was entirely unnecessary if this truly was a standard traffic stop. "Home," she said simply, keeping her voice calm and steady. She'd once been taught that in fraught situations, composure could act like a protective shield. "Home, huh?" Henderson repeated. The corners of his mouth twitched like he was holding back a laugh. Rooker, listening a few steps away, shifted his weight and exchanged glances with Henderson. Something unspoken passed between them. Henderson's next words would set the tone for the entire confrontation. "Step out of the vehicle." Ebony's heart pounded louder. She was no stranger to the law, but she also knew the kind of games corrupt cops played. She asked if there was a valid reason, reminding Henderson she hadn't been speeding, nor had she committed any observable traffic violation. "We got probable cause," Henderson snapped, though he never stated what that cause might be. Ebony weighed her options. She had the power to call out their bluff immediately, but that might tip her hand prematurely. She wanted to see how far they'd go. When Ebony stepped out of the car, Henderson wasted no time in ordering her to stand by the trunk. Rooker hovered near the driver's seat, rummaging through the center console, the glove compartment, even Ebony's personal purse, without a warrant. Ebony's instincts flared. This was exactly the sort of unconstitutional search she suspected Brooklyn's cops were committing. Her every muscle tensed as she watched Rooker rummage around in her personal belongings. She could confront them, demand to see a warrant, or let them dig their own grave deeper by continuing their unlawful search. In a subtle, careful voice, Ebony said, "Officer, you have no right to search my property without consent or probable cause." Henderson turned so sharply that Ebony half expected him to strike her. "Don't tell me about rights," he spat, drawing closer. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, and he jabbed a finger just inches from her face. "You people think you can mouth off and get away with it. You want to make this difficult, sweetheart?" Ebony's jaw clenched. She was outraged, but forced herself to remain measured. She said nothing, letting her silence challenge him. Henderson flicked his eyes to Rooker, who rummaged a few moments more before letting out a sharp, triumphant exclamation. "Bingo!" Ebony's eyes followed Rooker's movement. He brandished a small plastic bag from beneath the driver's seat. She recognized the crystalline substance as meth at once, but Ebony had never touched the stuff in her life. It certainly wasn't hers. Her insides twisted, fury and shock rising in her chest. They were framing her. Just like so many of the rumors had claimed, this was real, and it was happening to her. Her mind whirred with the ramifications. If two random cops had the gall to try this on her, how many other innocent people had they done this to? Henderson's smug grin confirmed everything Ebony needed to know. Well, he said with a sneer, "seems you're in possession of illegal narcotics, Ms. Williams." He said her name like it was a curse. "That's a felony." Time seemed to slow. Ebony felt the sting of adrenaline course through her veins. She reminded herself, breathe, they've just committed a grave mistake. She was a sitting U.S. attorney, collecting evidence, and these men had no idea. A volley of responses rushed through her mind. She could produce her federal badge and watch them crumble into apologies and groveling, but that might scare them into covering their tracks. She also knew that if they actually booked her, it would open up a bigger can of worms, records, statements, potential bribes from the judge. The unraveling might be massive, and that's exactly what Ebony wanted. A chance to expose everyone involved. A lesser person might have panicked. Ebony, however, saw only an opportunity to bring the entire ring to justice. The hardest part would be swallowing the indignity of it. She chose her words carefully. "I've never seen that before in my life." Henderson let out a low laugh. "They all say that, sweetheart. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute a controlled substance." As the cold handcuffs bit into Ebony's wrists, a flood of memories washed over her. Her mother's warning about crooked officials, her father's lectures about the significance of her role in a justice system that often turned a blind eye to corruption, and the vow she'd made to use her legal prowess to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Every nerve in her body screamed at the injustice, but Ebony embraced the moment with calm resignation. She did not resist. She did not reveal her identity. It was a short drive to the station, but it felt like an eternity in the cramped back seat. The rank odor of stale cigarettes clung to the upholstery, and Ebony's thoughts churned furiously behind a mask of stoicism. She stared at the passing streetlights, one after another, flicking through her mind's eye like shards of possibility. Henderson and Rooker chatted up front, discussing the bust they'd made with the same casual arrogance as if it were a done deal. Ebony watched their reflection in the rear-view mirror. She saw no remorse, no second thoughts. Their voices carried an air of victory. But oh, how little they knew. They pulled into a small police station, a squat brick building that had seen better days. Flickering fluorescent lights gave the lobby a sickly yellow glow, and the reception desk sat behind bulletproof glass. Rooker and Henderson led Ebony inside, her hands still cupped behind her. The woman at the front desk arched an eyebrow at Ebony, but didn't question the situation. Likely she'd seen too many black defendants march through these halls to raise any alarm at one more. Ebony's mind was already calculating how she could use each step of this booking process as ammunition. Fingerprints, mug shots, logs of the evidence. The system left a paper trail, and Ebony intended to follow it every step of the way. They placed her in an interrogation room that reeked of stale coffee and sweat. The table was scratched and dented, accompanied by 2 rickety metal chairs. Tacked to the wall was a corkboard featuring pinned-up memos and flowcharts for ongoing cases. There was a battered tape recorder on the table and a single overhead light that cast a harsh glare. Ebony's eyes caught the reflection of her own face in the metal surface. She looked calmer than she felt. She ran through her plan again. If they followed the rumors pattern, they'd press her with menacing threats. They'd claim she faced decades in prison if she didn't cooperate. And cooperation could mean anything. Maybe they'd offer a shady deal or demand money. But Ebony had a feeling there was more going on behind the scenes, especially with that unscrupulous judge rumored to take bribes. The question was, would these cops try to get her pay them off? Or would they just rely on their judge friend to do the rest? Detective Henderson entered first, slamming the door behind him. Sergeant Rooker followed. Neither bothered with formalities like reading Ebony her rights. Immediately suspicious and telling, Henderson folded his arms over his chest and stared at Ebony like a cat eyeing a trapped mouse. He gave a slight nod to Rooker, who positioned himself near the door. The air in the tiny room felt tight, practically vibrating with tension. "Let's make this quick," Henderson said. His tone was chillingly casual, but Ebony could sense the underlying hostility. "We've got you with enough meth to put you away for years. Now, some of my associates tell me you've been lurking around certain neighborhoods, talking to folks, stirring up trouble. So, Ebony, want to tell me what you're really doing in Brooklyn County?" Ebony said nothing. Her arms ached from the angle of the handcuffs, but she remained unflinching. Sergeant Rooker spoke next, stepping forward with a menacing scowl. "You looking to make deals? Sell? Or are you picking up for yourself? We can find out. We can also decide how big a problem we want this to be for you." Still, Ebony held her tongue. Inside, her brain raced. She considered how to respond. If she revealed the truth now, they might cover their tracks. If she remained silent, they might become more brazen, giving her the evidence she needed. She parted her lips slightly, letting out a measured sigh, and then answered them with a question of her own. "Am I under the impression I should be offering you something to lighten my sentence?" They exchanged another look, one Ebony couldn't quite decipher. Henderson leaned in, placing his hands on the table. "Depends on what you've got. Cash, information, favors. Maybe we can see about a lighter sentence if you cooperate." A flush of revulsion coursed through Ebony, though she kept her composure. "Isn't that up to a judge, not you?" This time, both men burst out laughing. "Oh, Hawkins is our go-to," Henderson said, making no attempt to hide the collusion. "If you're thinking you'll get a fair shake, let me save you the suspense. Either you play ball, or you'll do time in Brooklyn County Jail. No questions asked." That was the moment Ebony felt a grim satisfaction. They were practically gifting her the rope they'd use to hang themselves. The fact that they openly admitted controlling a judge suggested a brazen arrogance she rarely saw, even among crooked officials. Most corrupt cops try to hide behind carefully worded threats, but Henderson and Rooker were broadcasting their entire game plan. It angered her, yet simultaneously confirmed everything she needed to know. For a moment, Ebony thought about her earliest days in law school, when she spent late nights reading about the Freedmen's Bureau and the Civil Rights era, determined to be an instrument of justice for her people. She remembered the searing lines of a speech by a civil rights leader who warned that power concedes nothing without demand, and she remembered her mother's tearful pride the day Ebony was sworn in as a U.S. attorney. Ebony had chosen a life in law enforcement for reasons far greater than a paycheck or prestige. She truly believed in justice. Henderson misread her silence as fear. He exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said, stepping back from the table. "We'll give you some time to think about it. There's a phone call you can make if you want a lawyer." The emphasis he put on lawyer carried a mocking tone, as though he believed there was no one in Brooklyn County with enough power to challenge them. Rooker grunted in agreement, and the two men left the room. Ebony let the tension roll off her shoulders for a moment. She was determined not to let them see even a flicker of intimidation cross her face. The second the door shut, Ebony cast a glance around the interrogation room. She noted the camera mounted in the corner. Was it actually recording, or was it just for show? Many smaller departments used dummy cameras to intimidate suspects. If it was active, she hoped the memory card or security system footage would become an exhibit in the ultimate case she would bring against them. By the time a uniformed officer, someone Ebony hadn't seen before, entered to process her intake, Ebony had mentally prepared for the booking. Fingerprinting, mug shots, an initial statement. It was humiliating, but Ebony forced herself to see the bigger picture. She was about to blow the lid off a conspiracy that likely ran deeper than just these two cops. Once the evidence was gathered, she could bury them in court. Her only concern was that they might try something violent or sinister if they felt cornered. She had to be careful to stay alive. Hours passed in a blur. Ebony found herself in a cramped holding cell with a flickering fluorescent light overhead. One other occupant, a young Latina woman who seemed terrified, kept staring at Ebony with guarded curiosity. Ebony gave her a reassuring nod, but said nothing. She wondered about the young woman's story. Had she been framed too? Ebony's mind whirled with the possibilities, sadness gripping her heart. She hated that this place existed as a dumping ground for people too powerless to fight back, while corrupt officers roamed free, treating the law as their personal weapon. Eventually, Ebony was summoned for a late-night arraignment. The county courthouse was located in an adjoining building. She was led through a series of corridors, painted a grim shade of institutional gray. Her reflection flickered across the polished floor tiles. She looked tired but resolute. Surreal as it was, Ebony was about to stand before the very judge rumored to be taking bribes. Judge Thornton Hawkins was a tall, balding man in his late 50s, with a stern face that seemed locked in a perpetual scowl. His bench was positioned on a dais, framed by the county seal. Henderson and Rooker sat off to one side of the nearly empty courtroom. The only other souls present were a bored-looking bailiff and a weary court clerk. "All rise." The bailiff droned, glancing at Ebony as if she were just another statistic. Hawkins fixed Ebony with a cold, meticulous stare. "You are charged with possession of a controlled substance with intent to distribute," he read from a file. "How do you plead?" Ebony's mind raced. She considered using this moment to reveal her credentials, but she wanted to see if he would push the bribe angle. She wanted a direct line to that conspiracy. She folded her hands in front of her, meeting his gaze. "Not guilty," she said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. Hawkins pursed his lips. "Detective Henderson, do you have the probable cause statement?" Henderson stood, clearing his throat, feigning an official posture. "Yes, Your Honor. We found Ms. Williams in possession of methamphetamine stashed under the driver's seat of her vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. We have reason to believe she's been distributing in the local community." Ebony felt her stomach tighten at the brazen lie. Hawkins observed her impassively. Then, as though reading from a script, he nodded. "Bail is set at $50,000. Court is adjourned until the preliminary hearing." Rooker took Ebony by the arm to lead her away, but Hawkins interrupted. "Hold on, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice low. "You should know that in cases like yours, things tend to move swiftly. It's in your best interest to cooperate with the DA if you want to avoid a lengthy sentence." Ebony forced an unreadable expression, though inside she boiled with anger. The hearing had taken all of 3 minutes, as though her fate was a foregone conclusion. This was how they did it. Set an impossibly high bail, push for a quick trial, secure a manufactured conviction from their bribed judge. Ebony's job was to gather proof that this entire process was rigged. She needed more, though, more evidence, more testimonies, more risk, even if it meant spending a night or two in jail. She was escorted back to the holding cell. The next morning, Ebony used her phone call to contact her only confidant in this case, her direct supervisor at the Department of Justice, Veronica Liu. Veronica was a no-nonsense attorney who had championed Ebony's assignment. Ebony had told her the broad strokes of the plan. If the corruption ran as deep as suspected, Ebony might get arrested under false charges. So Ebony had made it clear that if she ever called, that was a signal everything had gone down. When Veronica answered, Ebony spoke carefully, aware the line might be monitored. "I'm where we expected I might be," Ebony said softly, leaning against the cinder block wall. "Yes, it's for the reason we predicted. Please proceed with the contingency plan. I'll hold tight until I hear from you." Veronica's voice on the other end sounded tense, but there was a steeled resolve. "Understood. Hold on. I'll get you out as soon as possible. Don't worry, we'll bury them." That phone call gave Ebony hope. She smiled grimly as she hung up. She'd planted the seeds of her infiltration carefully. Now, the Department of Justice had a reason and the impetus to swoop in and investigate. She could hold her head high, even in the squalid bowels of the county jail, because she knew the cavalry was on the way. The next 2 days were a blur of monotony inside Brooklyn County Jail. Ebony was processed, patted down, handed an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, and assigned a bunk in a cramped cell with one other inmate, an older black woman named Clarice. At night, Ebony lay awake listening to the distant echoes of guards yelling at inmates, steel doors clanging shut, and the sound of heartbreak and the endless shuffle of feet against concrete floors. She recognized the system's cruelty in each detail. Innocent or guilty, the powerless were all treated alike here. Ebony suspected Clarice wasn't guilty of what she was charged with either. Every time Ebony tried to initiate conversation, Clarice would speak in hushed fragments, as if even the walls had ears. On the 3rd day, Ebony was called to meet with her public defender, a man who introduced himself as Lloyd Mason. Mason seemed well-intentioned but overworked, the kind of lawyer handling a mountain of cases simultaneously. Ebony appreciated his earnestness, but also understood that as soon as she revealed her identity, everything would change. When Ebony walked into the small conference room for her legal meeting, Henderson was there. He sat in a corner, arms folded, eyes fixed on her. The gall of it made Ebony's pulse quicken. He was using intimidation tactics, eavesdropping under the guise of security. Mason protested that they needed privacy to discuss privileged information, but Henderson shrugged. "Sorry, short-staffed," he said, not bothering to hide his smirk. Mason tried to proceed. "Ms. Williams, we have a hearing in 2 days, and the DA is already offering a plea deal. 5 years if you plead guilty, with the possibility of parole in 2. They claim they have strong evidence. Now, I don't want to pressure you, but the judge is known to be tough. If you go to trial, you could be facing a decade or more." Ebony read between the lines. The system was orchestrated to push defendants into plea deals, so the cops and judge never had to reveal their corruption in open court. She needed to time her revelation just right. Clearing her throat, she spoke carefully. "I didn't do this, Mr. Mason. I have reason to believe the officers planted the evidence. I plan to fight." Henderson let out a low chuckle from the corner. Ebony didn't bother to look at him. She continued speaking to Mason. "I want to plead not guilty. When we go to court, I'm requesting a separate hearing on the legality of the search." She turned slightly, letting her gaze pass over Henderson. "I also suspect certain improprieties with how the arrest was handled." Mason nodded, looking uncertain but respectful. "All right, if that's how you want to proceed. That's exactly how I want to proceed, Ebony confirmed. She gave Henderson a meaningful look, and he returned it with a dark glare. She could sense he was itching to retaliate. He had expected her to fold and accept the plea, but Ebony never folded. That afternoon, Ebony found herself in a yard, an open-air space surrounded by high fences topped with razor wire. The sky above offered a stark contrast of freedom against her forced confinement. Other inmates shuffled around in small clusters, some exercising, some talking quietly, and a few glaring suspiciously. Ebony felt a wave of vulnerability. In prison attire, she looked like everyone else, but a sense of determination flooded her. She was collecting every detail, every violation. She noticed that whenever she moved, there was at least one guard's eye on her. They knew she was a risk. Probably Henderson had told them to keep close watch. Ebony wondered how many other lives Henderson had trampled. Her thoughts went to the next hearing. She'd use it as a platform to challenge the search and the entire process. Then she let the Department of Justice swoop in with a full-scale inquiry. She played the conversation she'd have with the judge in her head, carefully balancing the desire to reveal everything with the strategic advantage of letting him incriminate himself further. All that hinged on making it to the hearing safely. That night, Ebony had trouble sleeping. A foul stench wafted from the hallway, a mix of stale sweat, disinfectant, and leftover food. Clarice whispered prayers in the bunk below, her voice trembling with pain. Ebony's heart twisted with empathy for her. She recognized the brokenness in Clarice's voice. She too had once felt powerless in the face of injustice, as a young girl watching cops rough up her brother on the street. Another jolt of anger coursed through Ebony when she thought how these same patterns had repeated themselves for decades. How many Clarices had come and gone? How many nights had ended with tears seeping into threadbare blankets? The next morning, Ebony was called to an unexpected meeting with Judge Hawkins. No official hearing, just a discussion. This was unorthodox. Generally, a defendant's contact with a judge outside of scheduled court appearances was heavily restricted. Ebony suspected foul play. Henderson was leaning on the judge to expedite her downfall. Ebony braced herself. She was led into a smaller courtroom, a place typically reserved for juvenile or family cases, with fewer seats and a more intimate setup. Hawkins was already seated behind a modest bench. No one else was present, save for Henderson in the corner again and a single bailiff. Hawkins didn't bother with formalities. "I've been informed you rejected the plea deal," Hawkins said coldly, tapping a pen against a file. "You realize you're risking a mandatory minimum sentence if you lose at trial, yes?" Ebony bowed her head politely. "I understand, Your Honor. However, I'm not guilty. I won't plead guilty to a crime I didn't commit." He let out a short, mirthless laugh, spoken like someone who hasn't spent much time in a place like this. He leaned forward. "I could offer you leniency, Ms. Williams. You see, out here in Brooklyn, we have a certain way of doing things. Cooperation is rewarded. Belligerence is not." Henderson shifted from foot to foot, shooting Ebony a meaningful glare, as though to say, "This is your last chance." Ebony steadied her breathing, letting the weight of the moment pass through her. She locked eyes with the judge. "That's kind of you to offer, but I believe I'll have my day in court." Hawkins's expression hardened. The pen tapping grew louder. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Bailiff, take her back." As Ebony was escorted out, she heard Hawkins muttering to Henderson, "Make sure you've got all your paperwork in order." The subtext was glaring. "Make sure we look untouchable." That evening, Ebony had an unannounced visitor, Veronica Liu. She arrived wearing a sharp navy blue blazer, escorted by a local official who seemed flustered to have a big city attorney in his midst. When Veronica entered the visitor's room, Ebony noticed her stiff posture. She was rattled but determined. "Ebony," Veronica said, voice echoing the nearly empty space. She gave Ebony a quick once-over, checking for any sign of mistreatment. Ebony sat on a plastic seat, separated by a plexiglass divider, typical for jailhouse visits, though the arrangement occasionally varied by facility. A guard stood at the door. "Veronica, it's good to see you," Ebony replied, doing her best to sound calm. She pressed the phone receiver to her ear, while Veronica did the same on the other side of the divider. They're letting you visit me here, so I suppose that means they haven't caught on to everything yet? Veronica lowered her voice. We've been subtle. Officially, I'm your lawyer from the city. Unofficially, I brought 2 federal investigators along with me. They're already here, scoping out the place. The plan is in motion. Ebony exhaled. Relief spread through her chest like warmth. That's good. I have reason to believe the judge is heavily involved. They didn't even bother hiding it. He tried to push me into a plea. Veronica nodded intently, her expression resolute. I've got the big guns on standby. The district court in the capital is aware, but we need more. We need an unassailable chain of evidence. Right now, it's your word against theirs. We do have some video from the station that suggests irregularities in the chain of custody, but the angle is poor. It doesn't outright prove they planted the drugs. Ebony felt the frustration surge. I'm due in court again tomorrow for a preliminary hearing. Henderson will testify about his probable cause. I'm hoping we can get them to slip up. In the meantime, if you can get access to any of their financial records, especially the judge's bank statements, that might be the key. Veronica's eyes gleamed. We're on it. I just wanted you to know you're not alone. Don't worry about bail. You'll be out soon. We have enough to raise suspicion at a federal level. If they refuse to release you, we'll escalate. Ebony closed her eyes, soaking in the surge of gratitude. When she opened them, her gaze was steady. Veronica, if something happens in court tomorrow, be ready. Count on it, Veronica promised, pressing her palm to the glass. Ebony mirrored the gesture. For a moment, their eyes locked in mutual determination. Ebony felt a fierce sense of solidarity, the kind of bond forged by fighting a righteous battle shoulder to shoulder. The next day arrived with a restless energy. Ebony was escorted from her cell at dawn, given a sorry excuse for breakfast, and then marched in handcuffs to the courthouse. She'd spent the night mentally rehearsing every angle for her argument. She questioned the stop, questioned the search, questioned the chain of evidence. She'd revealed just enough of her credentials to rattle them, but not enough to make them back down entirely. Her aim was to corner them, make them sweat, make them slip. Then the cavalry would charge in. The preliminary hearing took place in a slightly larger courtroom than the one Ebony had seen before. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating the dust motes in the air. The wooden pews were mostly empty, except for a few curious onlookers and a cluster of local attorneys who had come to see the big bust. Henderson and Rooker were present, wearing their full dress blues for intimidation. Judge Hawkins presided from the bench, his expression as impassive as chiseled stone. The bailiff called the court to order. State your name for the record. Judge Hawkins commanded Ebony. She rose from the defense table, taking a moment to straighten her posture. Ebony Danielle Williams, you're here for a preliminary examination of the charges against you. The state will argue probable cause for possession with intent to distribute. Do you understand? I do, Your Honor, Ebony said. Then with measured confidence, before we begin, I request to represent myself pro se during this hearing. My assigned counsel is aware, and I have a right to do so. A murmur rippled through the sparse audience. Hawkins looked mildly surprised, but quickly masked it with annoyance. Are you sure about that? I am, Ebony said, unwavering. Hawkins pursed his lips. Very well. Detective Henderson, please take the stand. Ebony watched Henderson swagger up to the witness box. He swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It took all of Ebony's discipline not to laugh at the irony. She walked to the lectern and glanced at Judge Hawkins, who gave a curt nod. The questioning began. Detective Henderson, Ebony said, voice echoing, please describe the events leading up to the arrest. Henderson launched into a carefully rehearsed explanation. Ebony's vehicle was swerving. He smelled narcotics. He searched the car and found drugs. So you claim you smell narcotics, Ebony repeated. From outside the vehicle? He nodded with overdone conviction. Yes, ma'am. Yet the substance you seized was methamphetamine, correct? That's right. Ebony paused, letting the moment stretch. Detective, can you describe the typical odor of methamphetamine? Henderson hesitated for a fraction of a second, but recovered. It's a strong chemical smell. Inside a sealed plastic bag under my seat, he shifted uncomfortably. It was strong enough to smell. My partner can confirm. At that, Ebony turned to Judge Hawkins. Your Honor, I like to question the plausibility of this. Meth doesn't have a pungent odor that carries outside a sealed container hidden under a car seat. If Detective Henderson is claiming otherwise, I'd like to introduce an expert witness eventually. For now, I want to highlight the discrepancy in his story. A low murmur spread among the few spectators. Hawkins rapped his gavel. Let's keep this orderly. Detective, continue. Henderson cleared his throat. Regardless, we found the substance. That's enough for probable cause. Ebony pressed on. You mentioned you found the substance, but not how. Did you have a warrant? Henderson stiffened. I saw it in plain view. In plain view, under the seat in a sealed bag. He bristled. It was partially visible. Ebony nodded slowly. And that was your reason for searching my purse and my glove compartment as well? He struggled to answer. We had probable cause. Ebony let the tension hang. Your Honor, I have reason to believe the entire search was unconstitutional. Additionally, I suspect the evidence was planted. Judge Hawkins narrowed his gaze at Ebony. Those are serious allegations, Ms. Williams. Indeed they are, Ebony agreed, her heart pounding. She turned back to Henderson. Detective, do you recall reading me my Miranda rights before or after the search? He swallowed. We read them to you on the scene, as standard procedure. I have no memory or record of that. Ebony fired back. Nor does the dashcam video show that event. Actually, the dashcam mysteriously went offline during the stop, didn't it? Henderson's eyes flashed. Technical malfunction. At that moment, Ebony allowed herself to reveal just a sliver of her true authority. Detective, are you aware that I'm an assistant U.S. attorney working under the Department of Justice? The courtroom erupted in a flurry of gasps and whispers. Henderson's face drained of color. Judge Hawkins pounded the gavel, demanding silence. Is that true? Hawkins asked, his voice tight. Ebony lifted her chin. Yes, Your Honor. I was here in Brooklyn County as part of an ongoing federal investigation into civil rights violations and alleged corruption. I chose not to reveal my position earlier to ensure I could witness any wrongdoing firsthand, without undue influence. Henderson's entire demeanor shifted. He squirmed on the stand. Ebony delivered her next words like a sledgehammer. And I have been collecting data, photos, statements, and official documents. I have reason to believe you have colluded with certain officers to systematically violate the rights of innocent citizens, many of them people of color. That includes bribing a judge to secure fraudulent convictions. Pandemonium broke out in the courtroom. Hawkins banged the gavel repeatedly, his face contorting with rage. Order! Order! His eyes darted nervously between Ebony and Henderson. Now the weight of Ebony's identity threatened to upend his entire operation. This was no powerless defendant. This was a high-level federal prosecutor with direct access to resources that could shatter his carefully constructed empire. Ebony continued, voice unwavering. I request an immediate stay of proceedings. Further, I request a federal investigation into the conduct of Detective Henderson, Sergeant Rooker, and any other officers involved in this case. I also move that Judge Hawkins recuse himself from this matter, given the strong appearance of impropriety. A tall woman in a neat pantsuit strode into the courtroom at that moment. It was Veronica Liu, flanked by two stern-faced federal investigators. The bailiff, uncertain what to do, stepped aside. Veronica spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm Veronica Liu, Assistant Deputy Attorney General. We have a federal injunction requiring this court to halt all proceedings related to Ms. Williams's case until further notice. Hawkins's face turned an alarming shade of red. On what grounds? He snapped. On the grounds that Ms. Williams is a federal prosecutor, and we have credible evidence of corruption in these proceedings, Veronica stated with crisp authority. She handed him a stack of documents, which he snatched with shaky hands. "Your Honor, the Department of Justice will be taking custody of Ms. Williams effective immediately." Ebony allowed herself a small exhale of triumph. The web of conspiracy had been yanked into the light. She watched Hawkins flip through the pages, anger boiling behind his eyes. Henderson stood like a frozen statue, his mouth opening and closing with no sound. Across the small crowd, Ebony spotted Rooker at the back of the courtroom, looking like he wanted to flee, but was rooted to the spot. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone seemed to understand, in that singular moment, that a bombshell had just dropped, and the fallout would be tremendous. Hawkins, still gripping the documents, realized he was cornered. If he resisted the federal order, he risked immediate sanctions or worse. If he complied, he risked losing everything. With a curt motion, he banged his gavel one last time. "Court is in recess," he growled, his voice barely hiding the panic within. Veronica turned to Ebony, offering a reassuring nod. The bailiff, confused but obligated to follow the federal directive, approached Ebony. "Ms. Williams, we're releasing you." Ebony let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The guard removed the handcuffs. For a moment, Ebony felt unsteady, but she quickly regained her composure. She stood tall, scanning the room. She saw the swirl of emotions on the faces of everyone present. Shock, fear, and a glimmer of hope in the eyes of those who realized the righteous reckoning had just begun. Outside the courthouse, the day was bright and clear, a welcome contrast to the gloom inside. Reporters from nearby counties, tipped off by Ebony's colleagues, had rushed to the scene, their cameras clicking madly as Ebony, Veronica, and the federal investigators emerged. Microphones were thrust forward, and Ebony took a moment to stand before the throng. In a clear voice, she declared, "I stand here today not just for myself, but for all those in Brooklyn County who've been wrongfully targeted by corrupt law enforcement and a compromised judiciary. The Department of Justice will not rest until we uncover the full scope of this corruption. Let this serve as a reminder that no one, no officer, no judge is above the law." Cheers erupted from onlookers who had gathered, some of whom Ebony recognized as residents who had been too afraid to speak up. Tears pricked at her eyes as relief poured through her. She was free, and with that freedom came the power to dismantle the system that had wronged so many. Veronica ushered Ebony into a waiting car, the crowd parting like a wave as they passed. Inside, Ebony sank into the seat, her mind reeling from the intensity of the last few days. Veronica spoke softly. "We have enough evidence now to file a formal complaint against Hawkins. We're also moving to arrest Henderson, Rooker, and potentially several others. We'll want your testimony in detail." Ebony nodded, momentarily overwhelmed by the swirl of victory, relief, and sorrow for all those who had suffered. She remembered Clarice, the older black woman, in the bunk below hers. She remembered the terrified Latina woman from a holding cell. She vowed then and there to help them, too. "I'll give you everything," Ebony said quietly. "Every detail, every conversation. We'll make sure justice is done for them all." Veronica squeezed Ebony's hand. "We will. And Ebony, you did what so many couldn't. You took the risk. You made yourself vulnerable to expose them." Ebony let the gravity of it settle. A wave of emotion swelled in her chest. She thought of her parents, her siblings, everyone who believed in her. She thought of the countless victims who had languished behind bars on trumped-up charges just like hers. This was the moment she had dedicated her life to achieving, using her position to bring real, meaningful change. It was only the beginning. In the following weeks, the fallout was enormous. Henderson was arrested, along with Rooker, after multiple officers came forward to corroborate Ebony's version of events. A secret ledger was discovered in a safe in Henderson's home, listing payments and payouts, proof of the bribes that had circulated for years. Judge Hawkins faced federal corruption charges, and soon more allegations emerged from defendants who'd been railroaded into harsh sentences. A wave of exoneration swept through Brooklyn County as attorneys filed motions to overturn convictions tainted by the judge's rulings. Investigators uncovered a labyrinth of lies, payoffs, and intimidation tactics that had trapped countless innocent people in the system. Through it all, Ebony worked tirelessly, collaborating with civil rights groups, the Department of Justice, and local community leaders to ensure that every victim of Hawkins's court had a chance to be heard. She personally saw to it that Clarice received legal counsel, helping prove her innocence in a matter of weeks. It turned out Clarice had been arrested on fabricated assault charges after refusing to pay an informal fine to an officer. Once free, Clarice tracked Ebony down in the courthouse hallway, tears staining her cheeks, and wrapped her in an embrace that spoke volumes. Words weren't necessary. Ebony felt the gratitude, the relief, and the triumph. In that same hallway, Ebony also encountered the young Latina woman she'd briefly met in the holding cell. The woman's name was Marisol. She had been accused of resisting arrest while walking home from work, an excuse used by Rooker to detain her without cause. With Ebony's help, Marisol's record was cleared. She cried tears of joy when the judge in a new hearing proclaimed her free. As the media frenzy intensified, Ebony found herself in the spotlight. She hated the notion of seeking glory in a profession that was meant to be about service, but she also understood the power of public attention in effecting systematic change. She granted interviews with a calm, measured tone, always redirecting focus to victims and the need for deeper reform in the justice system. Hashtag Justice for Brooklyn trended on social media, spurring thousands of people to share their own stories of being wronged by a system that was supposed to protect them. One sweltering afternoon, a major demonstration took place on the steps of the Brooklyn County Courthouse. Civil rights activists, formerly incarcerated individuals, local leaders, and national news crews all converged. Ebony stood at the podium, gazing at the mass of faces. A hush fell as she took the microphone. "I came to Brooklyn under the suspicion that injustice was being carried out in darkness," she began. "What I found was far worse than I imagined. But I also found community that refused to remain silent. Brave people who told their stories, spoke their truth, and demanded better. I'm not the hero here. The heroes are those who kept fighting day after day, who shared their pain with the world, and who said, 'Enough!'" A roar of applause followed her words. In the crowd, she spotted Clarice, Marisol, even some of the children from the after-school program she'd helped. One young girl held a sign that read, "Thank you, Ebony." A tear slipped down Ebony's cheek as she realized that sign symbolized so much more than gratitude. It symbolized hope. In the months that followed, Brooklyn County underwent a massive overhaul. The police department was restructured from top to bottom, with federal oversight ensuring that new officers underwent rigorous training. A new judge was appointed to replace Hawkins, someone with a reputation for fairness and a commitment to community. Lawsuits against the county piled up, many of which were settled, providing compensation to those who had suffered under a corrupt regime. On a personal note, Ebony faced a wave of interviews and job offers once the dust settled. She could have chosen a comfortable path, perhaps climbing higher in the DOJ hierarchy, but her heart called her elsewhere. With the support of Veronica, Ebony set up a permanent civil rights task force in Brooklyn. She wanted to be sure that the changes she'd helped enact weren't just temporary. She wanted a long-term presence in the community, a watchdog group that would educate citizens on their rights and keep officials accountable. One evening, long after the scandal had become national news, Ebony took a quiet walk through the same street where Henderson and Rooker had pulled her over. The lamppost cast soft light onto the asphalt. She paused at the curb, remembering the flash of blue and red, the suffocating fear, and the way her life had pivoted in an instant. She closed her eyes and exhaled slowly, letting the memory pass through her. She hadn't broken. She had emerged stronger. And in doing so, she'd helped break the vicious circle that had ensnared so many innocent people. Over time, Ebony became something of a legend in Brooklyn. Her story was told and retold, often embellished with dramatic flourishes. How she'd matched wits with a corrupt judge in open court, how she'd outsmarted the entire police department, how she'd endured the humiliation of arrest for the greater good. Folks whispered reverently about the day the crooked cops and their crony judge finally toppled. Every retelling ended with the same moral. You never know who you're messing with, and you never know how powerful a single brave voice can be. But for Ebony, it wasn't about legend or fame. It was about the people, about Clarice, about Marisol, about every child who would grow up feeling safer, because the tyranny of a few had been exposed. It was about the promise she'd made to herself many years ago, when she first opened a tattered Constitution book and vowed to stand on the side of justice, no matter the personal cost. She remained in Brooklyn for years, mentoring young lawyers, community organizers, and at-risk youth. The after-school center, where she'd volunteered, thrived with new funding. She often reminded the kids, "Don't be afraid to speak up. Corruption flourishes in silence. Use your voice because it matters." And so the story concluded not with Ebony riding off into a sunset, but with a blossoming sense of unity in a place once dominated by fear. Hers was a story of resilience and redemption, a living testament to the adage that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, especially when guided by courageous hands. Long after the headlines had faded and new crises occupied the nation's attention, Brooklyn County bore the mark of Ebony's legacy. The ripple effects of one person's determination to stand against corruption spread far and wide, reminding everyone that even in the darkest corners of the system, hope and justice could shine through, if only one dared to confront it head-on. And if ever there was a final word to be said about it, it was this: never underestimate the power of a single individual armed with truth, integrity, and the law on their side. Because sometimes the last person you'd think to suspect in a quiet, humble county might just be the one who takes down the entire corrupt machine piece by piece until the only thing left standing is justice.